You didn't arrive here by accident. Something deeper brought you, the longing to breathe more deeply than your routine allows, the quiet ache for rest that doesn't depend on things being fixed, scheduled, or resolved. And maybe somewhere along these days, you've begun to see that relief doesn't come from carrying less. It comes from knowing who carries it with you. You don't have to hold everything together by yourself anymore. You don't have to be strong where you're worn out, steady where you're unraveling, or present where only pressure remains. There is a place where your limits are fully understood. And it's not far. It's safe, near, and found in the heart of God. The spiritual journey rarely moves in straight lines. It doesn't always feel bright or obvious. Sometimes faith feels silent while fear screams. Sometimes prayer feels lonely while anxiety spins louder. But even when you're lost somewhere in the middle, God hasn't lost track of you. He isn't nervous about your timing. He's not pacing while you hesitate. He sees the fatigue behind your eyes, hears the thoughts you haven't formed, understands the sighs you release in the dark. He holds steady when everything else shakes. He draws near when you hide. He waits, not with impatience, but with compassion that never demands you be okay before you are loved. You can stop running. You can stop trying to earn what has already been freely given. You can let go of the looping thoughts, the quiet panic about what might fall apart if you let your guard down. God never asked you to hold the universe together. He invited you to be a child. Children don't carry the house. They rest in the presence of the one who does. Children aren't responsible for managing every outcome. They look up, not inward, and trust that love won't forget them. Your soul needs that reminder. You weren't made to carry everything all the time. You were made to live anchored. Anchored in truth that doesn't change with the weather, in love that doesn't shrink when you falter, in grace that doesn't need performance to remain. That anchor isn't a phrase or a philosophy. That anchor is a person. And that person is a presence, a constant, calm, faithful presence that becomes your shelter, not when you're fixed, but when you're honest. Maybe that's why the rest you've been chasing hasn't arrived through answers. Maybe it's because what you need most isn't a resolution, it's relationship. There's healing in letting go of the question, when will it get better? And learning to say instead, I'm still here, even tired. That's where things begin to shift. When you stop performing, stop forcing, stop posturing, and allow yourself to be held in the middle of it all. Not because you've solved it, but because you've stopped solving alone. The kind of peace that stays doesn't come from a fixed plan. It comes from a surrendered heart. The strength that lasts isn't built through pressure. It's received in presence. And presence doesn't require perfection. It just needs space, breath, a return. That's why Calm Your Heart was written, not as a solution for your thoughts, but as a sanctuary for them. A quiet place where your questions don't need answers to be accepted. Where your prayers don't have to be pretty to be heard. Where scripture doesn't shout, but sits beside you like a friend who isn't in a hurry. Inside those pages, you'll find moments, not deadlines, not pressure, not advice designed to fix, but sacred space to feel, to breathe, to realign with the voice of peace that's never stopped speaking. And if your soul whispered, "This sounds like me," if the spinning thoughts, the quiet heaviness, the need to just pause without being judged, if all that is familiar, then maybe this is for you too. Not when things are perfect, not when you've figured it out, but now, while you're still tired, while you're still healing, while you're still learning that surrender is not the end of strength, it's the beginning of rest. You're allowed to be in process. You're allowed to hold tension and still be held by grace. You're allowed to be honest about how hard it's been. The story doesn't end because you're worn out. It doesn't end because you cried in silence. It doesn't end because you've come to the end of yourself. In fact, that may be the very place God's been waiting to meet you. Let that be your new rhythm, not fixing everything before you can breathe, but breathing as a form of trust. Let it be your new way of walking, not racing toward outcomes, but remaining close to the one who writes stories deeper than you could plan. Let it be your new kind of strength, not independence, but intimacy. So if this series spoke to you, if it gently confronted, quietly comforted, reminded you that you're seen even in what feels small, then keep walking from that place. You don't need the whole map. You just need to start with presence. Stay where peace lives. Keep company with hope. And maybe pause here for one last honest question. What would change if your next decision came from rest instead of rush? If your heart needed that, then maybe someone else's does too. Stay close. And when you're ready, come back. There's more grace waiting, and you're always welcome here. Worship was never meant to be contained in one building or assigned to one day. Faith doesn't wait for polished shoes or organized rows or scheduled sermons. It begins in the rawness of real life, in the morning breath of someone who doesn't feel holy, in the quiet stretch of a body that barely slept, in the whisper of a name before the noise begins. Sunrise doesn't just signal the start of your schedule. It marks the invitation to live from your center instead of from your surface. And when the center is built on trust, on presence, on the nearness of a God who doesn't wait for Sunday, everything begins to align differently. Before the world defines you by how much you accomplish, faith reminds you who you already are. Before people make demands on your time, God calls you first. Before opinions shape your self-worth, the voice of love anchors your identity. You don't have to wait for a worship leader to begin lifting your heart. You don't have to wait for a sermon to remind you of the truth. It's already here. It's already now. It's already yours. The Spirit doesn't hold office hours. He moves in morning shadows and speaks in unfiltered silence. He enters your awareness as soon as you open the door. Some days you'll wake up tired, not just physically, but spiritually. The weight doesn't vanish overnight. You carry things into the morning that didn't resolve in the dark. But that's where faith grows, not in the absence of weight, but in the presence of grace that meets you underneath it. Real belief is not tested in atmospheres curated for worship. It's tested when you choose to believe again before anything gets better. It's tested when you respond to the sunrise with surrender instead of self-reliance. That response, though invisible to others, is loud in heaven. Not every spiritual moment feels sacred. Some feel small, but small choices shape big trajectories. And the choice to pause before planning, to listen before performing, to worship before worrying, that choice is how faith begins not just weekly, but daily. You were never meant to live in cycles of Sunday highs followed by 6 days of silence. You were made to walk with God in every breath, in every task, in every waking hour. That walk doesn't begin at the church door. It begins when your heart says, "Here I am, again, still, yours." There is power in the decision to acknowledge God before anything else. That act rewires the soul. It reminds your body that it is not the master of your worth. It reminds your emotions that they are not the authors of your hope. It reminds your mind that it was made to be led, not to lead. When the Spirit is your first awareness, peace is no longer an afterthought. It becomes the posture through which you enter everything else. You can hear sermons and still forget to listen. You can sing along and still resist surrender. But you cannot invite God first thing in the morning without something inside shifting. Even if the shift is subtle, even if you don't feel it right away, something in the spiritual realm realigns. You are no longer starting from lack. You are starting from love. That love doesn't ask for performance. It doesn't wait until your thoughts are pure or your intentions perfect. It meets you in the clutter, in the fog, in the grogginess of another unpredictable day. And still, it calls you worthy. Still, it calls you known. Still, it speaks peace before you earn it. That's the kind of love Sunday was made to remind you of, but it was never meant to contain it. The same Spirit who fills you during corporate worship waits for you at sunrise. He doesn't need a set list. He doesn't require an audience. He simply asks to be invited, to be honored, to be given space in the sacred ordinariness of your morning rhythm. That invitation doesn't change him, it changes you. It softens you before you're hardened by headlines. It steadies you before stress gains a foothold. It cleanses your lens before comparison sets in. Faith that begins at sunrise doesn't need volume to have value. It doesn't depend on an environment to remain active. It grows from desire, from humility, from the deep knowing that your life doesn't belong to you. And that's a relief, not a burden. You don't have to carry it all. You only have to carry awareness of who walks beside you and who leads you from within. Let your first words be more than mental preparation. Let them be spiritual alignment. Let your first thoughts be shaped by eternity instead of urgency. Let your focus be fixed before your feet start moving. That focus isn't natural, it's cultivated. But it's worth cultivating because everything else bends around it. Priorities become clearer. Emotions become quieter. Reactions become slower. Compassion becomes deeper. These things are not produced by trying harder. They are birthed in being present. God is not waiting for you to get it all right. He's waiting for you to recognize that He's already near. The beginning of the day isn't about proving anything. It's about posturing yourself to receive everything that's already been promised. You are not asking God to come. You are allowing yourself to see that He never left. Sunrise is not a reset because the sun returned. It's a reset because mercy did. The light that enters your window is a reflection of a deeper light, the one that refuses to abandon you even when you feel unqualified to keep following. That's where faith becomes more than belief. It becomes rhythm. It becomes air. It becomes your first instinct, not your final resort. Let this be the pattern that forms you. Presence before productivity, reverence before reaction, scripture before strategy. You don't need a spiritual high to be spiritually rooted. You need consistency. You need space. You need truth louder than tension. And that starts with the first yes of the morning, the one no one sees, but heaven never overlooks. Worship was never supposed to be confined to emotion. It was meant to be woven into discipline. And discipline born of love doesn't feel like striving. It feels like safety. The kind of safety that reminds your soul it doesn't have to find its worth again every day. It simply has to remember where it comes from. If you've lived with your faith attached to external moments, it's time to go deeper. It's time to let God become your first voice, your quiet strength, your rooted identity. And that doesn't begin on stage. It begins in stillness. That kind of stillness doesn't require silence around you. It requires permission within you. Permission to pause. Permission to listen. Permission to receive before you try to respond. No one else may see this decision. It won't always be visible. But the fruit will come. And it won't be measured by how much you accomplish. It will be measured by how deeply you walk, how kindly you respond, how patiently you endure. Those things are not accidental. They are the overflow of a soul that didn't wait until Sunday to believe. Your kitchen can be a sanctuary. Your commute can become a space for communion. Your first breath can become an offering. Every mundane task becomes infused with meaning when done from the place of presence. Faith isn't always loud. Often, it is quiet obedience in the same direction. It is remembering that God didn't call you to be impressive. He called you to be with Him. When you start with God, you stop starting from fear. You stop launching into your day as if everything depends on you. You stop reacting to the world and begin responding to the Spirit. That shift doesn't make life easier. It makes you anchored. And anchored souls aren't thrown by every wave. Let the sunlight be a reminder God hasn't changed. The light returns because the covenant still stands. And that covenant didn't begin with your effort. It began with His love. That love is still here, still available, still ready to meet you in the raw, honest, groggy places where religion can't reach, but relationship always can. The first 10 minutes of your day don't need to be impressive. They need to be intentional. They need to be surrendered. They need to be real. That realness is what turns routine into worship, what turns your morning into a movement of grace that follows you into every room. Faith doesn't flourish only in the visible. It grows in hidden, faithful starts. The kind you repeat even when no one notices. The kind you return to even when you're discouraged. The kind you hold on to when you feel weak, not because you're strong, but because you remember who is. So tomorrow, when the light enters your window again, let your soul rise before your schedule. Let your heart speak before your phone does. Let your spirit listen before you build your plan. You don't need to chase spiritual moments. You need to honor the spiritual invitation already present in the ordinary. Faith begins here. Not when the church doors open. Not when the music swells. Not when the preacher speaks. Faith begins before you've stood up. Before you've fully woken. Before the world has told you who you are. It begins when you remember who He is. Peace doesn't always arrive with silence. Sometimes it comes in the middle of motion, not because everything around you is calmed, but because something within you has aligned. That alignment doesn't happen by accident. It's the result of ordering what truly matters, of placing first what was always meant to lead, of allowing your inner world to reflect the rhythm of the kingdom instead of the chaos of the culture. When priorities are distorted, peace becomes elusive. When God is given any place other than first, rest turns into restlessness, and clarity becomes clouded by striving. Before the weight of the world begins pulling on your thoughts, something deeper begins speaking to your spirit. It asks questions that aren't loud but are deeply honest. Who do you look to first? What has your affection? Where does your trust go when the future feels unclear? The way you answer those quiet questions will shape the way your soul walks through noise. Peace is not the product of perfect conditions, it's the fruit of correct order. When the heart is turned toward what matters most, every lesser thing loses its ability to dominate your emotions. You can be busy without being scattered. You can be active without being anxious. You can carry much without being crushed, if what you carry first is surrender. God never asked you to organize your life around productivity. He asked you to build everything around presence. The order is not a suggestion, it's a spiritual law. When He is first, everything else finds its place. But when anything else is first, everything else feels heavier than it was ever meant to be. The reason peace feels far isn't always because you're doing too much. It's often because your soul is giving first place to something too small to carry that weight. When relationships define you, peace becomes fragile. When success determines your identity, rest becomes conditional. When opinions shape your decisions, clarity becomes inconsistent. But when the foundation is built on the unshakable truth of God's presence, nothing can fully unseat your peace, not even the unpredictable. You were never designed to be ruled by your schedule. Your heart wasn't made to be led by external urgency. Your spirit can't thrive under pressure to please everyone. True peace begins when the throne of your heart is cleared of everything that tries to sit where only God belongs. That clearing may feel like loss at first, but what's removed makes room for what lasts. And what lasts brings calm in places where chaos once ruled. Order isn't control. It's surrender. It's not about managing everything. It's about submitting everything. That submission isn't passive, it's powerful. It declares that your days aren't dictated by pressure, but directed by presence. When your priorities reflect your faith, your life begins to reflect peace. Not because the world changes, but because you no longer expect it to give you what only God can. Sometimes peace doesn't require changing your surroundings. It requires changing your structure. When the day begins and ends with distraction, you'll feel scattered even in moments of stillness. But when the framework of your time, attention, and energy is submitted to eternal things, the temporary loses its grip. It no longer has the authority to rule your mood. It no longer decides your worth. It no longer determines your direction. You may think it's the circumstances causing your unrest, but often it's the misplacement of affection. When the heart chases what can't satisfy, anxiety follows closely. But when the soul is anchored in what's eternal, even uncertainty feels less intimidating. Not because you have answers, but because you've settled into alignment with the only one who truly sees the whole picture. The temptation to rearrange your day around what's urgent will always exist. Needs will always knock. Notifications will always call. But that's why priority is sacred. It chooses what leads you. And when the first voice you listen to is heaven's, the rest of the voices lose their ability to rush you. They might still speak, but they don't shape. They might still demand, but they don't define. They might still press, but they don't pull you away from peace. A reordered heart doesn't ignore responsibility. It simply refuses to let responsibility become identity. You can show up with excellence without being enslaved to expectations. You can be faithful without being frantic. You can work hard without being ruled by outcomes. That balance doesn't come from better planning. It comes from spiritual placement. It comes from building your life around the truth that peace is a person, not a result. Some days you'll feel the drift. You'll sense your soul chasing something just beyond reach. That's your reminder, not your failure. It's an invitation to pause, to assess, to realign. Realignment is not a detour. It's the daily rhythm of a heart that knows where it belongs. Don't be discouraged by the need to come back. That return is where peace begins again. Peace isn't something you wait to feel. It's something you choose to follow. And following peace means following the one who speaks with clarity, who leads without confusion, who builds without burden. His pace isn't rushed. His voice isn't reactive. His presence isn't dependent on how well you're performing. That's why placing him first isn't just wise, it's essential. When priorities are right, your reactions change. You stop panicking in the face of pressure. You stop spiraling when plans fall apart. You stop attaching your value to what fluctuates. That shift doesn't mean the storm stops. It means you found shelter before the rain even began. And that shelter doesn't leave when things get loud. It stays. It holds. It speaks peace into places that used to break under pressure. Sometimes the loudest thing in your life isn't the world around you. It's the inner chaos of a misaligned heart. And the only remedy for that is return. Return to the voice that calms. Return to the truth that centers. Return to the presence that restores. That return isn't dramatic. It's daily. It's subtle. But it's everything. You don't need to master your schedule to find peace. You need to surrender your schedule to the master. That surrender creates space, not just in your calendar, but in your soul. And in that space, you stop striving. You start receiving. You start remembering what truly matters. You start becoming who you were when peace was your native language and pressure hadn't yet taken your attention. Let your day begin with alignment. Not with haste, but with holy intention. Let your soul remember before your feet move. Let your thoughts settle before your hands begin. Let your focus fix itself not on the problem, but on the presence that doesn't shift. That sacred starting point becomes the framework for how everything else unfolds. You don't need to be more efficient, you need to be more centered. Efficiency without alignment is exhaustion in disguise. But when alignment leads, efficiency becomes peaceful. You move not because you must prove something, but because you've already been approved. That assurance can't be manufactured. It can only be received when the heart is still enough to remember who holds it. Let the Spirit set your sequence. Let truth build your framework. Let love reorder what stress has disfigured. That reordering isn't always easy, but it is healing. It brings peace where there was once panic. It brings gentleness where there was once reaction. It brings wisdom where there was once noise. And it all begins when your first priority is no longer what you do, but who you're with. You didn't wake up unknown. Before the first alarm rang, before your eyes blinked against the morning light, before you gathered your scattered thoughts into focus, God had already walked through your entire day. Nothing you'll face is unfamiliar to Him. Nothing planned or unexpected escapes His sight. You are not entering this day with partial direction or a vague hope for guidance. You are being led by a shepherd who sees what you cannot, who holds what you fear, who walks before you with full knowledge of every detail your heart hasn't even named yet. There's a stillness that enters the soul when you remember that truth. Not a stillness because everything has slowed, but because your trust has deepened. That stillness is what quiets the urgency. It's what steadies you when interruptions come, what anchors you when uncertainty tries to dictate your pace. You were not designed to map your day alone. You were created to listen, to follow, to remain in rhythm with the one who does not guess, does not react, does not improvise. His leadership is intentional. His timing is precise. His covering is constant. Let your soul return to that posture before anything else begins. Before your hands take hold of what needs to be done, let your heart rest in what has already been prepared. Trust isn't passive. It's active surrender. It's choosing to yield before the path is clear. It's moving forward without demanding proof. It's letting go of the need to predict every outcome and instead embracing the presence of the one who already knows them. You will be tempted to lead yourself. Your mind will try to convince you that planning equals protection. Your anxiety will whisper that control brings safety. But those voices, though loud, do not speak truth. True peace isn't found in managing everything. It's found in yielding to the one who holds everything. And that yielding isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Let His knowledge become your comfort. Let His foresight become your safety. Let His presence be enough when answers remain unavailable. There is no moment too complex for His clarity. No tension too tangled for His wisdom. No detour too hidden for His guidance. He does not lead from a distance. He walks beside you with the awareness of what's ahead and the gentleness to guide you through it, one step at a time. Trust often begins where visibility ends. You won't always feel confident about the next decision. You won't always have certainty in your plans. But that's where faith becomes tangible. That's where surrender becomes a path, not a theory. When you stop waiting for full understanding and start walking in quiet obedience, you begin to live not by your own ability, but by the confidence that He sees what you cannot. The path may twist. The interruptions may come. The timing may confuse you. But your uncertainty does not unsettle Him. Your doubt does not disqualify His direction. He remains steady, faithful, calm in ways your heart has forgotten how to be. And every time you pause long enough to realign your trust, He reminds you, you're not navigating this alone. You don't need every answer this morning. You don't need a blueprint. You need presence. You need nearness. You need assurance that you can trust the voice that knows the terrain ahead. And that voice speaks not through fear, but through peace. Not through panic, but through promise. You don't have to force your way into clarity. You simply have to follow the one who already holds it. Let Him lead you slowly if needed. Let Him guide you through delay if that's where refinement happens. Let Him hold your pace if moving faster would break something sacred. Trust doesn't mean rushing into outcomes. It means resting in direction. It means believing that the path is not random, that your steps are not wasted, that even detours are known before you take them. Your urgency is not His pace. Your fear is not His guide. Your confusion is not His starting point. He leads from eternal perspective. He guides from unshaken wisdom. He directs not based on what you feel, but on what He knows, and what He knows is not up for negotiation. It is full, complete, compassionate. Stop asking for control and start asking for alignment. Stop chasing certainty and start choosing communion. Peace does not come when your plan is finalized. Peace comes when your will is surrendered. When you begin your day by remembering who knows it best, everything else loses its weight. The pressure lifts. The noise quiets. The fear begins to bend beneath the authority of trust. There's strength in not knowing when you know who does. There's freedom in not leading when you're being led by perfect love. There's courage in not controlling when your hands are in the hands of the one who shaped the day before time began. That kind of surrender doesn't shrink your power. It restores your peace. You don't have to guess how this day will unfold. You don't have to obsess over outcomes you can't reach. You don't have to fear what has yet to appear. You have a shepherd, not a schedule. You have a guide, not just a goal. You have access to wisdom higher than anything your timeline can produce. And that access begins not with striving, but with stillness. Let your trust speak before your strategy. Let your surrender shape your posture. Let your stillness be an act of resistance against fear. There is no better way to move forward than with a heart position to follow. That positioning begins when you admit your limitations, not with shame, but with relief. You were never asked to carry what only God can lead. And He is leading, even when you don't feel it. Even when progress feels invisible. Even when questions remain unanswered. Even then, He is present. Even then, He is working. Even then, He is unfolding things your mind couldn't plan even if it tried. That kind of leadership can't be mimicked. It can only be followed. You are not late. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are right where grace knows how to meet you. You are right in the middle of a day that God has already seen. And in His vision, there is provision. In His knowledge, there is covering. In His sovereignty, there is safety. You don't have to earn it. You simply have to trust it. So trust it before you feel it. Trust it before anything makes sense. Trust it when the day feels heavy. Trust it when things are unclear. Trust it when everything within you wants to take control. Let trust be the pattern that forms your posture. Let it replace the noise with knowing. Let it breathe life into what fear tried to choke. Let it carry you where your plans can't. Peace comes when you let go of needing every piece to fit. Peace grows when you surrender your map for the master's hand. Peace stays when trust becomes your rhythm, not your reaction. That rhythm doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. The presence of a heart that says, I'll follow even now. Victory doesn't begin in the moment of breakthrough. It starts in the moment of surrender. It starts when your first movement isn't toward a solution, but toward the presence that has always gone before you. You don't have to wait until the end of the battle to be certain of the outcome. You only need to be sure of where you began. And when your beginning was anchored in God, the outcome has already been settled. Even when the path looks unpredictable, even when the middle feels uncertain, even when everything around you seems louder than truth, there's something unshakable about a life that starts its rhythm in the right place. It doesn't mean the storms won't come, but it means the soul isn't built on sand. That kind of foundation doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from surrendering sooner. From choosing, before anything else, to align yourself with the one who doesn't just know how the story ends. He already stands at the finish, holding your name in victory. You were never meant to reach the promise by way of performance. You were created to arrive in the strength of the one who leads you. When you start with God, you don't move forward in fear. You move forward with confidence that doesn't depend on circumstance. That confidence becomes your compass. It becomes your protection when delay tempts you to quit. It becomes your fire when resistance tries to steal your progress. It becomes your peace when the path is longer than expected. Faith doesn't demand that you see the finish line. It only asks that you start in the right direction. That direction always begins at the feet of the one who calls you deeper. He doesn't lead you through ease, he leads you through obedience. And that obedience doesn't guarantee comfort, but it guarantees covering. You are not promised a life free from difficulty, but you are promised the presence of God in every difficult place. Starting with Him redefines how you measure progress. It shifts your eyes from outcomes to intimacy. It realigns your motives from proving your worth to receiving your identity. It teaches your heart that victory isn't the absence of struggle. It's the assurance that nothing will separate you from the one who walks with you through every moment of it. When you've started in surrender, no amount of resistance can reverse what's already been settled in heaven. You'll be tempted to begin in your own strength, to build a plan before you build an altar, to chase clarity before you sit in communion. But that path always leads to burnout. Starting in self leads to striving. Starting in control leads to confusion. Starting in God leads to peace that surpasses understanding and power that isn't dependent on energy, it's dependent on abiding. Victory isn't won by the loudest voice or the fastest move. It's secure in the quiet choices that no one sees. The decision to pray before reacting. The moment you forgive before being asked. The surrender of plans that seemed perfect but didn't carry peace. These are the quiet steps that lead to unseen victories. These are the moments where heaven sees the direction of your heart and says, this is where strength begins. God doesn't just walk with those who win. He walks with those who trust. And trust begins before the victory is visible. Trust looks like keeping pace when the pace feels slow. Trust looks like worshiping when the answer hasn't arrived. Trust looks like stepping forward when fear tells you to freeze. That kind of trust isn't shallow, it's forged in the fires of obedience. And every act of obedience becomes a declaration. I believe you more than I believe what I see. Start your plans with prayer. Start your work with worship. Start your thoughts with truth. Start your day with surrender. These aren't tasks to impress God. They are lifelines to stay in step with Him. When He leads your beginning, He shapes everything that follows. He orders what seemed scattered. He clarifies what felt confusing. He redeems what looked wasted. You were never meant to build your own path. You were meant to follow the shepherd who already sees the terrain. He knows where the danger lies. He knows where the strength will be needed. He knows where to pause you for rest. When you trust that knowledge, you stop forcing your own way forward. You start walking in rhythm with wisdom instead of reaction. Some days won't feel victorious. Some steps won't seem significant. But when you've started in the right place, your soul learns to recognize fruit even in unseen soil. You begin to believe that progress isn't always visible. That depth is being formed when nothing feels dramatic. That the root is growing even if the blossom hasn't appeared. And you learn to rest not in what you see, but in who holds what's unseen. Victory becomes less about results and more about relationship. Less about arrival and more about alignment. Less about applause and more about abiding. And that kind of victory cannot be stolen by delay. It cannot be diminished by doubt. It cannot be canceled by failure. Because it doesn't rest on what you do. It rests on where you started. If you began in presence, you're not behind. If you began in surrender, you're not failing. If you began in prayer, you're not forgotten. You are being led by a faithful God who finishes everything he starts. And he finishes not with a rush, but with purpose. His timeline isn't punishing you, it's protecting you. His silence isn't neglect, it's preparation. His leading isn't always loud, but it's always enough. You may feel tempted to change direction. You may question if you heard him clearly. But every time you go back to the beginning, every time you remember where this started, you'll find the same voice calling you to trust again. That voice doesn't speak with shame. It speaks with strength. It reminds you that he hasn't changed, even if everything else has. Start with God, and you'll always find your way home. Start with God, and you'll always carry peace into the places that threaten to steal it. Start with God, and you'll walk through fire with a flame that doesn't consume you. You were created to move with heaven inside you, to walk through the temporary with the eternal as your guide. Let the first step be reverence. Let the first word be surrender. Let the first breath be invitation. That pattern builds a path that doesn't bend to pressure. It holds underweight. It breathes even in darkness. It keeps moving even when the scenery looks unfamiliar. Because that's what faith does. It follows even when it's not sure of the next turn. Victory doesn't always look like what you expected. It looks like finishing with faith still intact. It looks like joy that survived the battle. It looks like compassion that grew in adversity. It looks like a soul that didn't lose its way when the road was longer than anticipated. It looks like peace that stayed even when answers did. Don't measure your success by speed. Measure it by surrender. Don't define your journey by visibility. Define it by voice. Don't chase outcomes. Follow obedience. And watch as the places that once held confusion begin to hold confidence, not because you figured it out, but because you followed well. Heaven's definition of victory is deeper than the surface. It's steadiness when shaking surrounds you. It's presence when the plan collapses. It's nearness when the night stretches longer than expected. That kind of victory doesn't have to wait until the end. It begins with the first yes. It begins the moment you say, God, I don't want to lead myself today. Let that be the start of every step. Let that posture frame every decision. Let that awareness follow you into every conversation. The victory isn't out there somewhere. It begins here, right now, at the feet of the one who already won. Tomorrow doesn't arrive with silence. It comes wrapped in invitations, decisions, distractions, and directions. It calls for your attention before your eyes have fully opened. The world doesn't wait for your spirit to settle. It comes running with urgency, expectation, and noise. But there's a moment quiet and hidden that carries more weight than any other, the moment you choose who comes first. That choice shapes the rest of your day. It defines the tone before the world has a chance to speak. It determines whether peace leads or panic lingers. It isn't about performance. It's not a ritual or a formula. It's about relationship. It's about remembering where your help comes from and who you belong to before your feet even touch the floor. The sacredness of morning isn't in the timing, it's in the direction. You can begin at any hour, but the question remains, who is given the first place? That answer doesn't come from emotion. It comes from intention. Even when you're tired, even when you're distracted, even when you feel unworthy, your spirit knows the way back to its source. You weren't made to face the weight of the day without the voice that steadies. You weren't meant to navigate decisions without the presence that leads. You weren't created to carry your soul alone. Every morning is a new mercy, not because the day will be easy, but because the invitation still stands. Return first. Return before you reach. Return before you run. Return before you perform. Return because it's who you are, not what you do. There is no shame in needing the reminder. You're not weak for drifting. You're human. And being human doesn't disqualify you from grace. It positions you to receive it. That's why tomorrow's power won't come from your preparation. It will come from your prioritization. What you place first reveals what you trust most. The noise will ask for attention. The schedule will demand energy. The emotions may fluctuate. But before all of that, there's space. Space to breathe. Space to surrender. Space to choose again. And that choice matters more than you know. Not because it impresses God, but because it aligns you with Him. Let that moment be quiet if it needs to. Let it be raw. Let it be honest. Don't wait until you feel spiritual. Start from where you are, from under the covers, from the edge of the bed, from the ache you carried through the night, from the questions that still don't have answers. That's where intimacy is born, not in perfect words, but in honest turning. You may not always get it right. Some mornings you'll forget. Others will rush past you. But each day is another opportunity to realign, to remember, to return. The discipline isn't for punishment, it's for restoration. It's the pattern that brings your soul back to what sustains. It's the rhythm that reorients your identity before the world tries to rename you. Don't underestimate the power of beginning in presence. It may seem small. It may feel unimpressive. But heaven sees the direction of your heart and it rejoices. Not because you performed, but because you came home again. That's what God longs for. Not distance, but nearness. Not perfection, but posture. Let tomorrow's first thought be anchored, not scattered. Let the first words be sacred, not scripted. Let the first breath be surrender, not strategy. That shift won't change everything at once, but it will change the way you walk through everything. It will give you eyes to see beyond urgency. It will give you ears to hear what really matters. It will guard your heart before disappointment can shape it. That first moment is a declaration, even if whispered. A statement to the soul, you're not alone. You're not in charge. You're not without guidance. That kind of truth isn't just comforting, it's foundational. It becomes the rock beneath the storm, the shelter before the pressure, the anchor before the tide. Start your day by remembering what doesn't change. Not your feelings, not your surroundings, but the one who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He's not surprised by what you'll face. He's not worried about what you can't fix. He's not measuring your performance. He's offering presence. The gift of beginning with God is not reserved for saints or scholars. It's available for the weary, the unsure, the ashamed, the overwhelmed. It's offered to the one who failed yesterday and isn't sure how to face today. It's extended to the one whose faith feels small but still reaches. That reach matters. That decision to reach again is victory in itself. You won't always feel the shift immediately. Sometimes the peace will arrive in layers. Sometimes the strength will come in moments. But the transformation is real. It happens every time you start from a place of humility instead of hustle. Every time you start with worship instead of worry. Every time you choose presence over pressure. Tomorrow morning, the world will ask for your attention. Your thoughts may start running before you even open your eyes. But you have a choice. A quiet, holy choice. A sacred return. You can speak before scrolling. You can listen before leaping. You can breathe before building. That pause is more powerful than you know. Let your first priority not be what needs fixing, but who deserves your affection. Let your first posture not be striving, but stillness. Let your first words not be problem-solving, but praise. That beginning shifts the atmosphere before you even leave the bed. It sets your eyes above the noise. It roots your confidence not in your capacity, but in God's consistency. That kind of rhythm doesn't form overnight. It forms in repetition, in choosing again, in coming back after forgetting, in refusing to give up on what you know your soul was made for. Don't let shame speak when you drift. Let grace speak when you return. You're never too far from a holy restart. You're never too late for realignment. Each sunrise carries the whisper of God, return to me first. Not because he needs the attention, but because your soul needs the reminder. The reminder that you are more than your plans, more than your pressures, more than your performance. You are his. And when he is first, peace follows closely. Let tomorrow's first light become your altar. Let the morning be less about tasks and more about trust. Let the routine become sacred not because it's impressive, but because it's consistent. That consistency transforms you. It reshapes how you see the rest of the day. It grounds your identity before the world has a chance to shake it. Don't underestimate how heaven sees that choice. The early reach, the first glance upward, the whispered prayer before words fully form. These are not small to the one who watches your heart. They are seeds, And every seed planted in surrender grows into fruit that lasts far beyond the moment. So when the alarm rings, when the responsibilities stir, when the schedule begins to rise, remember what you've already decided. God comes first. Not when everything settles. Not when you feel worthy. Not when there's time. First. Always first. That habit becomes a refuge. That rhythm becomes an anchor. That choice becomes a way of life. And from that place, everything else begins to align. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but peacefully. Because when God is first, even chaos finds limits. Even sorrow finds hope. Even waiting finds purpose. Let tomorrow morning be sacred. Not because the sun rose, but because your heart did. Let it rise in faith. Let it rise in remembrance. Let it rise in quiet surrender. And as it does, let heaven meet you there, with mercy new, with strength fresh, with love unchanged. Before the world finds you, something else already has a moment still untouched, sacred in its silence. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It waits. There, in the softness between sleep and motion, your soul decides what voice it will follow. Not every day begins with light outside, but every morning begins with choice. To be scattered or cindered. To carry or surrender. To scroll or seek. The heart tends to wander when it's not anchored early. You wake up, and already the pull begins, toward news, toward noise, toward unfinished lists and unspoken fears. But that first gaze, the one you give before anything else, holds a kind of quiet power. It's not just about what you do when the alarm rings. It's about who you turn toward when your mind is still unclothed and your soul still unguarded. The way your thoughts open in the morning will determine how they close at night. Not because everything will go as planned, but because presence at the start reorders what pressures try to rearrange. When God becomes the first voice, every other sound loses its urgency. Not because the noise disappears, but because it's put in its place. You weren't designed to begin the day by bracing for survival. You were created to begin it by receiving mercy. He doesn't measure you by how early you rise or how many verses you quote before coffee. He looks at where your heart turns instinctively. Not out of obligation, but out of trust. That instinct can be cultivated. It grows in the soil of consistency, watered by honesty, not perfection. The first 5 minutes of your morning aren't sacred because of ritual. They're sacred because of relationship. Some mornings offer silence. Others are chaotic before sunrise. Still, the invitation remains. To speak to the one who already knows what you'll face, and yet waits to face it with you. There is no formula, only posture. There is no script, only surrender. And surrender, when offered early, shapes how the soul responds to everything else that follows. You don't need a quiet house to find him. You don't need a candle lit or a perfect prayer prepared. You need awareness, a simple inner turning, a whispered name, a slow exhale in the direction of trust. That moment, that movement of soul, is where alignment begins. And aligned hearts are not easily pulled apart by chaos. Your phone will wait. Your inbox won't vanish. But your soul will slowly be shaped by whatever it receives first. The world is fast. God is not. And that's the invitation to begin slow. To let His presence be the first covering over your day. To allow the shepherd to lead before you step into anything else. There is an unseen cost to starting your day empty. The kind of emptiness that doesn't come from lack of time, but lack of tethering. You can be busy before dawn and still lonely by noon. But when the heart is filled with God's nearness first, everything else loses its ability to claim your worth. The voice of anxiety fades when you've already been spoken over by peace. You don't have to start with answers. Start with acknowledgement. Begin not with strategy, but with surrender. Faith that shows up early is often quiet, but powerful. It's not loud. Declarations or long petitions. It's the stillness that says, I trust you more than I trust myself to carry this day. That posture becomes a resting place for divine strength to settle in. The Holy Spirit doesn't need a ceremony to arrive. He needs your openness. Not a perfect hour carved out, but a heart willing to say, before I face anything else, I choose to face you. That's how the unseen armor is fastened. That's where the day finds its shape, not in external order, but internal alignment. You are not the first to wake up tired. You're not alone in beginning with doubt or weariness or even numbness. But even that counts. Even the groggy, uncertain whisper of, "Help me today," becomes a seed of faith. Not all beginnings feel sacred. Some just feel honest. And God meets you in both. Victory isn't found in finishing every task. It's found in starting from the right foundation. When peace comes first, pressure doesn't hold as tightly. When worship opens the door, worry has less room to settle in. The order matters, not because God is fragile, but because you are. The soul drifts quickly. It needs direction before the day starts giving it one. And sometimes direction is as small as a verse remembered while brushing your teeth, a line of truth repeated in traffic, a breath offered before a meeting. These small beginnings shape deep roots. They don't shout, they don't impress, but they keep you close to the one who guides. You were never asked to conquer the morning. You were invited to bring it into his presence. And in doing so, you bring your whole self, doubt, hope, tension, joy, without needing to fix any of it first. The honesty of a surrendered start matters far more than the structure of a spiritual routine. You won't always feel the shift. Peace doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a settling of the chest, a softening of the breath, a subtle reminder that you're not moving alone. And in that place, something holy grows, dependence, not on your own strength, but on the one who never runs dry. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real. And if your mornings have been heavy, filled with thoughts that don't stop, noise that enters before your eyes even open, you're not failing. You're simply being invited back to simplicity. Not the kind that erases responsibility, but the kind that resets your focus. That's why I've written small reflections over time, quiet places like Calm Your Heart, born not out of expertise but out of exhaustion. For mornings that feel too crowded to pray clearly. For hearts that don't know what to say but still want to be found. Not a guide to fix your faith, but a space to feel held inside it. You don't have to wait for silence to seek peace. Sometimes peace comes first and silence follows. Sometimes the act of turning your heart, even in the noise, is what opens the door to calm. So maybe tomorrow isn't about doing more. Maybe it's about doing first things first. Maybe it's about remembering who you are before the world reminds you who it wants you to be. Maybe it's not about waking up perfectly, but waking up present. The way you start isn't about how strong you feel. It's about who you trust to carry you. And that choice, made before anything else, changes how everything else unfolds. So let the first word you speak be sacred. Let the first glance be upward, not outward. Let the first breath remember who gave it. Because you weren't meant to start from pressure. You were made to begin from peace. Not every war begins with noise. Some begin in silence, when your eyes open and your fingers, almost without thinking, reach for a glowing screen. It feels harmless at first. A quick glance, a small scroll, a casual update on what you might have missed while you slept. But before your soul can even breathe, you've already opened a door, one that lets in comparison, urgency, and the weight of a world that never stops spinning. Before your body moves, your attention has already surrendered. And when attention surrenders, direction follows. There's something deeply spiritual about what you reach for first. Not because the object is sinful, but because the pattern shapes your posture. When your first conversation is with a device instead of with your creator, something sacred gets delayed. Not lost, but postponed. The voice that could have steadied you gets buried beneath the noise that demands your reaction. Morning doesn't ask permission to begin, it just does. But what happens within it is still within your power. Before you become accessible to the world, you have an invitation to become available to heaven. Not in the form of an obligation, but as a lifeline. A chance to root before the wind picks up. A moment to anchor before the tide pulls. You weren't created to wake up overwhelmed. You were formed to rise in rhythm with grace, to remember who you are before anyone else tells you who you should be. But you forget. We all do. We trade presence for pace, connection for content, communion for commentary. And the shift is so quiet we often don't notice it, until peace feels like a memory instead of a promise. When your heart opens with headlines, your mind enters defense mode. When your eyes are filled with images of others, your worth starts to feel negotiable. When your soul is fed by updates instead of scripture, anxiety takes root before wisdom has a chance to speak. This isn't about legalism. It's about awareness. It's about realizing that your first thoughts don't stay isolated. They shape how you show up to everything else. God waits, not with guilt, but with grace. He doesn't shame your instinct. He understands the pull. But he also knows what you miss when your affections are divided. He knows what begins to unravel when your inner world is led by externals. He sees the cost of waking up already spinning, already analyzing, already performing in 1,000 invisible ways. Peace doesn't come from control. It comes from order. When God has first place, clarity follows. The world can still be loud, but it doesn't sound the same. The pressure can still exist, but it doesn't carry the same weight. Your eyes become trained to see differently. Your heart becomes tuned to listen with discernment. And all of it starts with what you do in the first 5 minutes. There's no shame in habit. But habits become altars when they're placed before the right presence. And the altar of your morning matters. Because something will receive your first affection. Something will shape your first reaction. Something will plant the first seed. And whatever that something is, it will grow. God doesn't compete for your attention. He simply waits for your affection. He waits for your breath to slow, for your spirit to lean, for your awareness to rise like dew before the sun. And he's not looking for eloquence. He's not asking for a monologue. He simply longs to be acknowledged, to be invited, to be the first voice your soul listens for. It's not about the length of the prayer. It's about the posture of the heart. A single whispered sentence can shape the atmosphere of the entire day. A single glance upward can silence the fear that threatens to build. A single, honest moment of connection can reframe everything that follows. That's the power of prioritizing the eternal before the temporary. There's a reason the enemy doesn't mind you being busy, as long as you're distracted. A distracted believer can still function, can still serve, can still appear composed. But underneath, their spirit begins to drift. Not because they don't love God, but because they forgot how much they need Him first. Distraction isn't always rebellion. Sometimes it's just a slow fade, one missed moment at a time. Screens don't feed your soul. They stimulate your mind. And stimulation isn't the same as strength. You weren't meant to start your day trying to keep up. You were meant to start by slowing down. Not everything that demands your attention deserves your devotion. But your heart won't know that unless you train it to recognize the difference. When your first instinct becomes communion instead of consumption, something shifts. You're no longer a servant to urgency. You become a student of peace. You stop reacting to every notification and begin responding from a place of rooted identity. The world doesn't stop spinning, but you stop spinning with it. You may not feel it instantly. Some mornings, the discipline feels dry. Some prayers feel mechanical. But faith doesn't grow through emotion. It grows through consistency, through presence, through showing up anyway. The phone will always wait. The inbox will always fill. But that holy hush before the noise, that's where eternity meets you. And eternity doesn't knock twice. Sometimes the miracle is not in what changes after prayer, but in who you become during it. When you begin with God, you carry Him through the chaos. Your reactions are slower. Your tone is softer. Your discernment sharpens. You don't absorb every emotion you encounter because your soul has already been fed something deeper. What you check first reveals what you trust most. It's a quiet truth, but a piercing one. Trust is not declared. It's demonstrated. When you choose to pause instead of pounce, to speak instead of scroll, to connect instead of consume, you're placing your trust not in what the world shows you, but in what heaven already knows. This isn't about ignoring reality. You will still have deadlines, messages, tasks, and conversations. But when your day begins with divine presence, none of those things get to define you. You no longer arrive at your responsibilities empty. You arrive covered, sent, strengthened by a source greater than yourself. There's a different kind of momentum that comes when your soul is anchored first. Not the momentum of speed, but of stability. You move with purpose instead of panic. You act from rest instead of rushing. And people notice. Not because you're louder, but because you're steadier. The pull to distraction won't disappear. But the choice to resist, it becomes easier with practice. Every morning is a chance to realign. To remember who you are before the world reminds you of what you do. To remember what you carry before the day asks you to prove it. To begin, not in pressure, but in presence. Maybe the shift is small. A minute before the phone. A verse before the news. A prayer before the planner. It doesn't have to be drastic to be holy. It just has to be honest. And honesty always finds an open door with God. You don't need a perfect routine. You need a prepared heart. One that starts the day not asking, what do I need to do? But who do I need to be with? Because who you're with determines how you walk. And when you walk with God, your steps are ordered, even if your schedule isn't. It's okay if yesterday started in rush. It's okay if you built habits that feel hard to undo. Today is a new altar, a fresh opportunity to reset the rhythm of your soul. God doesn't keep score. He keeps covenant. And covenant always welcomes return. You might be surprised by how much calmer the morning feels when it begins without a screen. You might notice that your thoughts feel more clear, your breath more steady, your spirit less agitated. And that stillness, that depth, that clarity, it came not because the day got easier, but because your soul found its anchor before the waves hit. Start small. Stay steady. Let silence speak louder than updates. Let truth come before timelines. Let presence become your pattern. Because the first voice matters. And the first voice shapes every other sound. You don't need a full hour to encounter God. You need a first moment. A single act of choosing Him above what feels urgent. A single breath offered before opinions arrive. A single touch point that says, I know where my strength comes from. The beginning of your day doesn't belong to distraction. It belongs to the one who designed the dawn. Honor doesn't begin with applause. It begins in the unseen places where choices are made in silence, where no one watches, no one claps, and no one knows how hard it was to obey. It starts in the sacred quiet of a heart that whispers yes to God, even when everything else says you're missing out. There is a kind of reverence that grows in the soul of someone who has chosen to put God first, not once, not occasionally, but consistently, deliberately, quietly. This kind of obedience doesn't always look impressive. It's not always understood. It doesn't make headlines or draw attention. But heaven watches. Heaven keeps record. And honor grows in the places where surrender is chosen, not because it's easy, but because it's right. You felt it, the tension between what feels urgent and what you know is eternal. The pressure to be visible, to succeed quickly, to keep up with everyone else's pace. Yet somewhere deeper, beneath the noise of ambition and the ache of unmet expectations, there's a longing to live for something that doesn't shift. Something that holds. Something that matters even when no one notices. That's where the voice of God still speaks. That's where His call to put Him first finds soil in you. Not in the busyness, but in the wrestling. Not in the spotlight, but in the stillness. He doesn't force Himself to the front of your life. He waits to be given that space. And when He receives it, something holy begins to grow. Putting God first doesn't always change your circumstances. Sometimes it changes your capacity. It deepens your perspective. It realigns your values. It teaches your heart to let go of lesser crowns and reach for something more eternal. You begin to understand that honor isn't what people say about you. It's what God sees in you. And He sees differently. He sees the motive behind the movement. He sees the posture behind the performance. When you prioritize Him above opportunity, He provides in ways you can't manufacture. When you choose His presence over your plans, He orders your steps through pathways you never could have built. It doesn't mean you'll avoid difficulty, but it does mean you won't face it without direction. There's a reason Scripture tells the stories of people who made God their first priority. Abraham left comfort to follow promise, not knowing where it would lead. Ruth stayed with Naomi, honoring a covenant over convenience. Daniel opened his window to pray, not to be seen, but to stay connected. Each one honored, not with fame, but with divine favor that outlasted their lifetimes. God's honor doesn't always show up the way you expect. It rarely comes in the moment you think you've earned it. But it always comes in the fullness of time, in the unfolding of seasons, in the quiet fruit of faithfulness. When you put Him first, you make room for His hand to shape what your striving never could. Choosing God above all doesn't mean you won't feel the pull of other loves. It means you learn to say no to what calls your name but can't carry your soul. It means you trade surface-level validation for deep-rooted peace. It means you walk away from instant gratification in order to build something eternal. The world rewards urgency. God honors order. And order begins with knowing who holds the first place, not just on paper, but in your priorities, your desires, your time, your voice, your internal posture. It's not a matter of saying He's first, it's living like it. You can't always explain the shift, but you'll feel it when He truly holds that space. Decisions become clearer. Rest becomes deeper. Pressure begins to release. Not because the circumstances are lighter, but because the center of your life has been re-anchored. You begin to walk with a quiet confidence, not in yourself, but in the God who holds the outcomes. Sometimes putting Him first means staying when you'd rather run. Other times, it means leaving when comfort whispers you should stay. It might mean saying no to something good so you can hold space for something holy. And those decisions, though costly, are where honor begins to take root. Honor looks like integrity when no one is watching. It sounds like worship when the room is empty. It feels like peace when the world is spinning. It doesn't seek to prove, it seeks to please. And that kind of posture cannot go unnoticed by the heart of God. You might feel forgotten. Others may seem further along. But faithfulness always leaves a trail. And heaven doesn't forget what you've laid down, what you gave up, what you surrendered in secret, what you trusted Him with even when it didn't make sense. None of it is lost. None of it is wasted. All of it is seen. The honor of God isn't about status, it's about intimacy. When you put Him first, you don't just receive guidance, you receive nearness. That nearness becomes your covering, your clarity, your unshakable foundation. You begin to live less from reaction and more from response. Less from fear and more from fullness. This world will offer you 1,000 opportunities to compromise, to rearrange your priorities, to chase visibility instead of virtue. But every time you choose Him above it all, something eternal is built within you. And eternity always outweighs the temporary. God's honor doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes in faithfulness. It finds you in the field like it found David. It calls you forward like it called Moses from the wilderness. It settles upon you quietly, like dew on a weary soul. You won't always feel it, but you'll walk differently when it's there. Putting Him first doesn't guarantee ease, but it guarantees alignment. And alignment leads to peace that doesn't break under pressure. A peace that isn't borrowed from circumstance, but built from trust. That trust isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It's consistent. And consistency in the right direction creates momentum heaven cannot ignore. When your private devotion outweighs your public display, that's where divine honor begins. When your prayers become the center of your planning, your path begins to reflect more than strategy. It begins to reflect surrender. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's the way the kingdom moves, not through force, but through faithfulness. You may not feel like you're making progress, but if you've placed Him first, you're exactly where you need to be. Obedience in obscurity still echoes in heaven. Surrender in silence still carries weight in the unseen. Nothing you give up for the sake of God is ever forgotten by the heart of God. He honors the quiet yes. He remembers the nights you chose prayer over distraction. He marks the mornings you open your hands instead of gripping control. He treasures the tears that fell when you said, I trust you, even here. That is the kind of life heaven crowns. Not with applause, but with presence. Not with fame, but with favor. Favor doesn't always look like open doors. Sometimes it looks like closed ones that protected you. Sometimes it sounds like no when you prayed for yes, but only because He saw what you couldn't. Sometimes it feels like waiting, but only because He's building something in you He doesn't want rushed. The reward of putting God first is not a smoother path. It's a deeper walk. A walk where you don't just believe in His promises, but become shaped by His presence. A walk where His timing becomes your trust, and His word becomes your compass. A walk where your pace slows because your spirit knows it is better to walk with God slowly than to run ahead alone. Let others chase their moments. You chase the maker. Let others measure success by speed. You measure it by surrender. Let others look for platforms. You look for altars. That's where God meets the soul most deeply. That's where his honor rests, not on the proud, but on the one who bows early and often. Whatever this season holds, place it back in his hands first. Not at the end of the day when you're drained, but at the start, before decisions are made, before emotions take over, before your heart wanders. Place it there in full. That is worship. That is trust. That is the kind of offering God honors. Before your feet touch the ground, something sacred has already begun. Not the schedule, not the routine, not the noise, but the awareness of who you woke up with. You didn't rise alone. You didn't enter this day by accident. Before your eyes fully opened, mercy was already present. Grace was already waiting. Love had already spoken your name again. That's why worship belongs there, at the very beginning. Not as performance, not as duty, but as response. There's a shift that happens when you wake up with worship, not because the day changes instantly, but because you do. The atmosphere within you takes shape before the one around you even speaks. You begin not by measuring what's ahead, but by remembering who's already here. Worship doesn't need music to begin. It needs recognition. And recognition turns ordinary mornings into holy ground. When worship is your first instinct, fear loses its first word. The things that used to lead your thoughts, worry, pressure, to-do lists, now wait in line behind the one who holds your breath. There's power in that rearrangement. Not because you've solved anything yet, but because you've chosen to surrender instead of strive. You've chosen presence before planning. You've decided that what's eternal deserves your first affection. Some mornings don't feel like praise. You wake up heavy. The ache lingers. The news hasn't changed. The body feels tired. But worship was never meant to depend on mood. It was meant to redirect it. You're not pretending when you praise. You're remembering. You're choosing to remind your soul that truth remains, even when emotion falters. This kind of worship doesn't always involve volume. Sometimes it's stillness. Sometimes it's a whispered phrase before the light enters the room. Sometimes it's a verse repeated while brushing your teeth. It's not about heightening emotion. It's about reorienting the heart. The first gaze of your soul sets the tone for every other look. And when that gaze is upward, the path ahead feels less overwhelming. You don't have to feel worthy to begin. You don't need the perfect setting. You just need honesty. And honesty sounds like, you are good even when I don't understand. It sounds like, I'm afraid, but I know you're near. It sounds like, thank you for another breath. That's worship. Not rehearsed declarations, but real response. God doesn't wait for you to clean up your mind before he meets you. He meets you inside it. He doesn't require a perfect heart to receive praise. He receives the trembling one, the questioning one, the tired one, especially the tired one. Because tired worship isn't weaker, it's truer. It says, even now I choose you first. The enemy loves to fill the morning with mental noise, to convince you that time is too short, thoughts too scattered, feelings too dull. But every time you push back against that current and lift even a single sentence toward heaven, you're realigning the entire direction of your day. You're declaring, even in weakness, that God deserves your first voice. When your morning begins with worship, you stop walking into situations defensively. You stop bracing for impact. You stop trying to control everything before you've even eaten breakfast, because praise turns your heart toward provision. It reminds you of how many times you've been carried. It steadies your vision. It strengthens your posture. It silences the inner critic before it can speak. You might still face interruptions. The calendar won't rearrange itself, but the soul that started in worship moves differently through disruption. Not faster, but deeper. Not louder, but clearer. When you've begun with heaven, the noise of earth doesn't feel as permanent. When you've remembered his presence, the absence of control no longer frightens you as much. Worship doesn't erase the pain, but it keeps the pain from becoming your narrator. It doesn't remove the unknown, but it teaches your soul how to rest inside it. That's why it must come first. Because whatever gets to your heart first usually gets to steer it. Every morning you choose to worship is an act of resistance against a world that teaches self-reliance. It's a holy refusal to begin from fear. It's a decision to walk into the day from a place of abundance, not anxiety. And that decision echoes louder than any news headline, louder than any distraction, louder than any demand. You may never see the fruit of that choice immediately, but roots grow in hidden places. And a life that begins in adoration becomes a life that moves in alignment. The outside may still feel chaotic, but the inside begins to settle. Not because the pressure is gone, but because peace has come. Starting the day in worship doesn't mean you'll avoid hard conversations, delayed answers, or fatigue. It means you'll face all of it covered. The covering doesn't make you invincible. It makes you aware. Aware of who goes with you. Aware of who sustains your breath. Aware of who defines your day. Worship opens the eyes differently than information. While information reacts, worship remembers. It remembers truth that transcends data. It remembers promises that outlast predictions. It remembers hope that isn't based on headlines. That kind of memory isn't passive, it's a weapon. It's how you fight battles you don't yet understand. The discipline to worship first becomes the doorway to spiritual discernment. You don't just respond to what happens, you begin to sense what God is doing beneath what's visible. You become sensitive to the small leadings, the subtle shifts, the quiet convictions. You begin to walk as someone who isn't led by circumstance, but by communion. There's a rhythm that emerges when the soul is trained in early praise. That rhythm steadies the heart before it starts rushing. It teaches your emotions that they don't need to run the show. It reminds your will that you're not living for approval, you're living from belonging. And belonging is best remembered when you've spoken to the one who calls you is. The first thought often shapes the rest. If your first thought is God's faithfulness, then fear doesn't get to shape your outlook. If your first posture is gratitude, then lack doesn't dictate your value. If your first act is surrender, then striving doesn't get to dominate the rest of your day. Gratitude isn't weakness, it's awareness. And awareness, practiced first, becomes strength under pressure. You begin to carry things differently, not because they've changed, but because you have. And that kind of change is where real transformation begins. You might not always feel inspired to worship, but worship doesn't need inspiration, it needs honesty. And honesty sounds like, I'm not okay, but I trust you anyway. It sounds like, I don't see the way forward, but I know you're already there. That kind of worship isn't fragile, it's holy. It's the sound of faith breathing through fatigue. Don't underestimate the weight of a morning song. Don't belittle the power of whispered praise before the world has had a chance to speak. Those moments may feel small, but they shift your atmosphere. They send signals to your soul about what matters most. And when the soul learns what matters most, everything else finds its place. Let the sun rise on surrender. Let your eyes open with expectation, not that the day will be perfect, but that God will be present. Let your first breath carry reverence. Let your first thought carry remembrance. Let your first word carry worship. And if no words come, let silence carry the weight of that offering. You weren't created to begin with burden. You were designed to begin with blessing. Not always felt, but always there. That blessing isn't tied to outcome. It's rooted in identity. And worship is how you come back to it, every single time. So before the notifications begin, before the responsibilities rise, before the doubts creep in, let the soul reach upward. Not out of duty, but out of desire. Not to earn favor, but to encounter the one who already loves you fully. That encounter doesn't require a soundtrack. It requires availability. And that availability, given early, becomes strength that carries you through the unknown. So tomorrow or the day after, or the morning you don't want to rise, remember what worship does. It steadies what would otherwise shake. It grounds what would otherwise float. It centers what would otherwise spiral. And in that sacred stillness, something eternal is born again. The mind wakes up before the body. Long before your limbs move or your mouth speaks, thoughts begin to form, quietly, quickly, relentlessly. They arrive without invitation, without filter, without mercy. Some are old, some are anxious, some are just noise, but all of them compete for the same thing, control. And the first voice your mind listens to will likely shape how it handles the rest of the day. That's why it matters what you hear before anything else. Not because you're trying to earn holiness, but because the soul wasn't designed to lead itself. When your thoughts begin without direction, they spiral. When your emotions stir without grounding, they deceive. But when God's voice enters first, everything else finds its rightful place. This world speaks early. It interrupts you before you've even opened your eyes. Notifications, headlines, expectations, noise, so much noise. And yet, in the middle of that clutter, heaven still whispers, not to shout over the world, but to speak before it. You were made to wake up and carry everything at once. You were created to rise into awareness of divine presence, to be reminded, before anyone else says a word, that you belong, that you're loved, that you are more than the weight of your performance, more than the echoes of yesterday, more than the fears of what might come next. The voice of God doesn't compete. It invites. It waits for your attention, never forces itself to the front. But when you give it space, when you give it first place, something shifts. The static begins to clear. The panic begins to slow. The burdens begin to lose their grip. Truth has a rhythm, and your mind was built to walk in step with it. But when you let the world set the beat, you start dancing to anxiety. You start believing urgency is more important than wisdom. You start letting external chaos create internal confusion. But you don't have to live like that. You can begin with a voice that shaped the stars. The one who speaks not to impress, but to align. The one who knows every hidden corner of your thought life and still draws near. The one who doesn't just want to be part of your day, he wants to be the anchor of your mind before the day begins. God's voice doesn't always sound like answers. Often, it sounds like peace. Sometimes, it's not even a word. It's a stillness. Presence. A reminder that you don't have to sort your whole life out before 8 a.m. You just have to remember who holds it. When your mind starts in truth, lies lose their volume. When your thoughts begin in worship, worry doesn't get to lead. When your perspective is rooted in eternity, temporary pressure stops feeling like identity. You can't stop every intrusive thought, but you can choose what you dwell on. You can redirect. You can rehearse what's real. You can quiet the critic with the voice of the comforter. That's not denial. That's discipline. And discipline that begins in surrender always leads to peace. Some mornings, the lies feel louder. You wake up already doubting, already running, already rehearsing every potential outcome that hasn't even happened yet. But even then, especially then, you still have a choice. Not to ignore what you feel, but to place it beside what you know. And what you know is this: God speaks peace into storms, not just around them. He brings clarity, not by removing all uncertainty, but by being with you in the middle of it. His voice doesn't promise ease, it offers presence. It brings the reminder that your worth isn't dictated by how focused you feel, that your value isn't measured by how quickly your mind obeys, that your belonging isn't lost just because your brain is tired. You were never asked to control every thought. You were invited to bring every thought captive, not through force, but through focus. And that focus begins with who speaks first. When the world gets the first word, your heart often spends the rest of the day trying to recover. But when God gets the first word, your heart starts from fullness. You're not trying to prove anything. You're not performing for peace. You're responding to the one who's already given it. Letting God's voice come first doesn't require perfect quiet. It doesn't need a flawless routine. It simply needs space. It needs intention. It needs a soul that says, before I begin, I want to be reminded who I am and who I am not. You are not your performance. You are not your productivity. You are not your past. You are not your panic. You are His, and His voice will always say so. That's why Scripture matters, not as obligation, but as orientation. Not to check off a task, but to align your spirit. The Word of God is not background noise. It is breath. It revives. It steadies. It reminds. It recenters. And when it's the first thing your mind hears, everything else is filtered through truth instead of filtered through fear. You've been conditioned to start with reaction, but you were designed to begin with reverence. That's not about being hyper-spiritual. That's about being deeply human, aware that you are fragile without divine perspective, and that perspective begins when you listen before you lead. God's voice won't rush you. It will refocus you. It won't condemn your wandering. It will call you gently back. That call doesn't sound like shame. It sounds like return. It sounds like you're safe here. It sounds like before the world speaks, your inner world doesn't need more information. It needs more presence. And presence isn't earned, it's invited. That invitation sits in every morning, every new breath, every waking moment before the noise. It waits for you to pause, to look up, to say, speak first. And when he speaks, things change. Panic softens. Focus returns. Kindness grows. Compassion deepens. Joy resurfaces. You start to notice people differently. You respond to pressure with a quieter posture. You don't carry everything as if it depends on you. Because something inside you remembers it doesn't. And that memory was placed there by the first voice. Some days, all you'll manage is one verse, one breath, one whispered prayer. That's not failure. That's faithfulness. Small beginnings are still sacred. God honors intention. And the heart that leans toward him, even while still trembling, is the heart he fills. Don't wait until your thoughts are perfect. Invite him into the messy ones, into the overthinking, into the fragmented attention, into the wondering and wandering, into the fatigue. He doesn't flinch at mental noise. He speaks into it until stillness forms. And in that stillness, your soul starts remembering what the world tries to make you forget. You are seen. You are held. You are guided. You are not alone. That kind of assurance can't be found in a headline. It can't be built by scrolling. It won't grow through constant stimulation. It only comes when you slow down enough to let him speak before the world does. You might not be able to control how the rest of the day unfolds, but you can control how it begins. You can decide who gets the first word. You can choose what your mind feeds on before anything else has a chance to shape it. And that choice, made consistently, forms a life that isn't just reactive, it's rooted. So tomorrow, or even now, when the noise rises again, remember what matters most. Not just what you hear, but who you hear first. That's where peace begins. Let God be the voice that breaks the silence. Let truth be the sound that enters before fear. Let presence be the pattern your mind learns to crave. Because your mind wasn't made to carry every voice. It was made to recognize one. You open your eyes, and before anything moves, before the world requires your strength, before the hours begin to pull, you are already accompanied. Not by pressure, not by duty, but by a presence deeper than breath, more constant than thought, older than time. The Holy Spirit does not wait until you have prayed perfectly. He does not enter when your thoughts are clear. He arrives in the first moment you acknowledge him, not as a distant guest, but as the closest inhabitant of your unseen life. You don't rise alone. You never have. Even when your mornings begin with confusion, even when your thoughts scatter before your feet touch the floor, even when you feel nothing spiritual stirring in your chest, he is there, nearer than your pulse, waiting not to be impressed, but to be welcomed, not to be understood, but to be received. And the soul that pauses long enough to whisper "come" before moving forward is the soul that walks not just with faith, but with power. The invitation is not ceremonial. It doesn't require poetic language or sacred posture. It only asks for honesty, for a turning inward that becomes a lifting upward, for a moment where breath becomes awareness and awareness becomes communion. That communion does not begin with clarity. It begins with surrender. The kind of surrender that says, I don't know what this day will bring, but I know who I need with me through all of it. Rising in your own strength leads quickly to striving. Planning without presence becomes performance. Doing before dwelling leaves you depleted before you even start. But when the first movement of your spirit is to acknowledge the one who already abides, something inside settles before anything outside begins. The pressure to perform fades. The urgency to prove loses its urgency. The desire to control softens in the presence of the one who already holds what you're afraid to release. There is a difference between waking up to a schedule and waking up to the Spirit. One rushes you into motion, the other invites you into awareness. One drives you with timelines, the other draws you with tenderness. One demands productivity, The other reminds you of identity. When the Holy Spirit is invited before your body even shifts, your soul starts from fullness, not from fear. You were never meant to be self-sufficient. That's not failure, it's design. The Spirit wasn't given as a backup plan. He was sent as a constant companion. Not a distant observer of your days, but the intimate presence within your hours, guiding, comforting, aligning, breathing life into every decision before it leaves your lips. But the invitation matters. Not because He needs permission to be present, but because you need permission to be led. The day has demands waiting. There are decisions to make, responsibilities to hold, emotions to carry, people to serve, expectations to manage. But before you hold any of that, you are held. The Spirit doesn't come to strengthen your plans, He comes to reshape them. He doesn't arrive to endorse your agenda. He reveals a better way. And when that way is sought before you rise, your steps become more than motion. They become ministry. He brings wisdom where confusion waits. He speaks peace where inner noise grows loud. He reminds you who you are when insecurity starts whispering familiar lies. He highlights people to love, prompts silence when reaction wants to speak, creates space in your soul for fruit to grow where impatience used to rule. But these things are not forced into your spirit. They are cultivated by invitation. There is no formula for being filled. There is only hunger. The Spirit doesn't respond to obligation. He responds to openness. Not to the length of your morning devotion, but to the posture of your dependence. And dependence is not weakness. It's strength with its knees on the ground. It's beginning not with what you must do, but with who you must walk with. It's choosing nearness over noise, presence over productivity, depth over distraction. Let the invitation come before the noise. Let it form before your hands reach for the phone, before your eyes scan for updates, before your heart gets pulled into 1,000 directions. The one who pauses in the earliest breath to say, "Lead me," will carry something that cannot be imitated: discernment that cuts through chaos, gentleness that withstands offense, patience that quiets reaction, faith that steadies when circumstances shake. This is not about starting your day perfectly. It's about refusing to start it apart. You don't need the right words. You don't need to feel something dramatic. You just need to ask. And that asking becomes atmosphere. The Holy Spirit fills not the impressive, but the available. Not the prepared, but the surrendered. Not the confident, but the yielded. Sometimes the invitation is silent. Sometimes it's whispered through clenched emotions. Sometimes it's a tear, a breath, a simple glance toward the ceiling, a sentence formed through tired lips. "I can't do this without you." That is enough. That is holy. That is what opens the way for something greater than effort. The Spirit will not push past your priorities. He will wait to be placed first. But when He is, everything else starts to settle into place. Not always quickly, not always visibly, but deeply. And depth is what your soul was made for, not surface-level survival, but Spirit-filled strength. There are mornings when heaviness wakes you before light does, when you feel the burden before you feel any belief. That is where invitation becomes not just good practice, but survival. The Spirit does not shame your weakness. He does not grow weary of your repeated need. He shows up every time, not as an observer of your exhaustion, but as the comforter who breathes through it. He won't demand your attention. He will wait for your reach. And when you reach, even clumsily, even inconsistently, even through layers of doubt, He responds with fullness. Not because you earned it, but because you asked. And the one who asks in the dark receives more than light. They receive guidance. This presence is not abstract. It becomes real when you stop performing. It becomes known when you stop pretending. It becomes powerful when you stop resisting. Let your spirit open before your schedule fills. Let your dependence be your starting place. Let the Holy Spirit be not an afterthought, but your first conversation, your first awareness, your first anchor. You were never expected to rise strong every morning. You were simply invited to rise connected. You don't need to be composed to begin. You just need to be available. And availability before the first step invites divine rhythm into your every other movement. So don't wait until things feel right. Begin where you are. Say what you can. Pause long enough to acknowledge the unseen nearness of the one who hovered over creation and now hovers over your day. That pause is not wasted. That breath is not small. That act of turning inward with trust will shape everything that follows.